At 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone lit up with a message from my father. Family dinner tonight, 7 p.m. sharp. Important discussion. Don't be late. I stared at the screen for a long moment because it had been 8 months since I'd heard a single word from any of them. 8 months since my graduation day. When I scanned the crowd for my parents and found only strangers. Silence like that gets loud after a while. So when the invitation finally came, I didn't ask why. I already knew what they wanted. What they didn't know was that I came prepared. I didn't take my own car. That decision happened almost automatically the moment I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. Pulling up to that house in one of my SUVs would have been a mistake. A loud one. The kind that announces success before you're ready to use it. And tonight, I needed control. So instead, I rented a sedan. Gray, mid-range. The kind of car that disappears in a parking lot full of other cars exactly like it. No polished chrome, no custom interior, no subtle signals that the person behind the wheel owns half a dozen luxury resorts scattered across 4 continents. Just transportation, camouflage. As I drove out of the city and toward the valley, the road slowly began to wind upward through the hills I grew up around. I hadn't been back in months, not since graduation. Not since the day I walked across that stage, scanning the crowd for familiar faces that never appeared. Funny how a place can hold memories like fingerprints. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon, stretching long shadows across the fields. The valley looked almost beautiful from a distance. Golden light spilled over the rows of vines, painting everything in shades of burnt orange and deep amber. For a moment, if you didn't look too closely, it still looked like the postcard version of our family legacy, the vineyard. 3 generations of pride, at least according to my father. The story had always been the same growing up. Hard work, tradition, land passed down from father to son. From the outside, it looked like stability, wealth, permanence. But distance hides a lot of things. As the road curved closer to the estate, the details began to sharpen. And that's when the illusion started cracking. The first sign was the gate. The tall white paint that used to gleam every summer had faded into a dull, chalky gray. Large strips of it had peeled away completely, exposing rust-colored iron beneath. I slowed as the gate creaked open, and the sound alone told me it hadn't been properly maintained in years. Neglect always starts small, then it spreads. The long driveway that followed used to be covered in thick gravel that crunched evenly under the tires. Now patches of dirt showed through where the gravel had thinned out. In some places the surface had worn so bare that dust lifted behind the car in pale clouds. Cost cutting, deferred maintenance, little decisions that stack up over time until the whole structure starts wobbling. And then I saw the vines. That's when everything became obvious. Most people see a vineyard and just notice rows of green leaves and grapes. It looks healthy by default, lush, romantic even. But I've spent the last decade building eco-resorts from raw land. I've worked with agricultural consultants, environmental engineers, water management specialists. You learn things. The leaves along the first few rows looked wrong. Instead of deep green and flexible, they were dull and brittle at the edges. Some curled inward like they were trying to protect themselves from the sun. The growth along the wires was uneven too. Gaps where new shoots should have been climbing. I slowed the car even more as I passed the first block of vines. The soil beneath them was dry. Not just summer dry, neglected dry. A vineyard can survive a bad season, even a rough drought year, but healthy operations adapt. Irrigation schedules change. Soil management adjusts. New plantings compensate for loss. This wasn't adaptation. This was slow decline. Row after row told the same story. Smaller clusters, weak growth, sections that looked like they hadn't been pruned properly, stunted, underfunded. And suddenly, the text message from my father earlier that afternoon made perfect sense. Family dinner tonight, important discussion. Right. I let out a quiet breath as I continued toward the house. He didn't suddenly miss his daughter. He didn't wake up that morning thinking about reconciliation. No, something was wrong here. Financially wrong. And when things went wrong in this family, there was always one solution they believed in more than any other. Someone else's money. The estate house came into view at the end of the drive, the same wide porch and tall windows I'd grown up around. From a distance, it still projected the same old money confidence. But now that I'd seen the vines, the driveway, the gate, the whole place looked different. Like a company building that hadn't realized bankruptcy was already knocking at the door. I parked the rental sedan at the far end of the circular drive, away from the other cars. Another small tactical choice. Let them underestimate me for a little longer. Before stepping out, I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. No makeup, no jewelry worth mentioning, just me. The version of me they remembered. The quiet daughter. The one who used to sit at that table hoping someone would finally notice her. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up my leather portfolio. Then I stepped out into the cooling evening air. For most of my life, walking into that house had meant walking into judgment. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like walking into a negotiation. And judging by the state of the vineyard behind me, they were the ones who needed something. I stood there for a moment beside the rental car, the evening air cooling the back of my neck. And something strange happened. The knot in my stomach, the one I'd carried with me the entire drive, loosened. Not completely, but enough that I noticed it. For most of my life, every time I came back to this house, I walked in carrying the same emotional baggage. Hope, anxiety, that quiet, exhausting need to prove something, to be seen, to be enough. But somewhere along the road tonight, the framework had shifted. I used to think about my family in emotional terms. Love, rejection, favoritism, hurt. Those words defined everything for years. Why Olivia got attention and praise while I got polite indifference. Why Joshua's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like national holidays, while my achievements barely registered a nod. Back then, I thought it meant something personal. That I had somehow failed the invisible test every family seems to run. But standing there in the fading light, looking back over the brittle vines and peeling gate, a different realization settled in. They had never been operating on emotion. They had been operating on investment. My parents didn't treat their children like children. They treated us like assets. It sounds cold when you say it out loud, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Every decision, every ounce of attention, every bit of praise, it had always followed the same logic. Return on investment. Olivia, my older sister, had always been the obvious winner in that equation. Beautiful, charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately draw attention. pageants, social events, charity galas. She made the family look good. She generated social capital. Joshua had his own version of value. Charming, outgoing, the golden boy who could sell a story to anyone who would listen. My father loved taking him to business dinners, introducing him to investors, letting him sit beside the men who made decisions. Joshua represented continuity, the next generation of the family brand. But me, I was quiet, studious, independent in ways that didn't translate well at cocktail parties. I didn't win trophies that looked good in display cases. I didn't attract the kind of attention that boosted the family name in public circles. I studied. I worked. I stayed out of the spotlight, which meant in their calculation, I produced very little immediate return. A low-yield asset. And when an investment underperforms long enough, investors eventually pull their money out. That's exactly what they did. They didn't scream or fight or openly reject me. That would have required emotion. Instead, they did something colder. They divested. Less attention. Fewer conversations. Fewer invitations to the moments that mattered. Eventually, barely any involvement at all. By the time I reached college, the pattern had become so normal, I stopped questioning it. I simply built my life somewhere else in places where effort actually translated into opportunity. Places where people evaluated results instead of family hierarchies. And over time, something interesting happened. The quiet girl they had written off started building things. Small things at first. Projects, partnerships, one property then another, a little eco-resort concept that most people initially dismissed as a niche experiment. Then the numbers started growing. Investors started calling, architects, environmental consultants, developers. Bit by bit, the thing I was building turned into something real. Something scalable, something valuable, and tonight standing outside that fading estate, the irony finally hit me. The market had shifted. The asset they quietly abandoned years ago had appreciated, not a little, exponentially. Meanwhile, the enterprise they had poured all their energy into the vineyard, the family legacy, the brand they were so proud of, was showing signs of collapse. Bad management, short-term thinking, a refusal to adapt. All the classic indicators of a failing business. And suddenly the dinner invitation made perfect sense. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a late-stage investor trying to buy back into a company they had written off. After the valuation had already skyrocketed, I picked up the leather portfolio from the passenger seat and closed the car door. Understanding that didn't erase the past. It didn't magically heal the years of being overlooked, but it did something better. It gave me armor. Because once you stop expecting love from people who only understand transactions, the game becomes very clear. And tonight, for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into that house as the overlooked daughter. I was walking in as the most valuable asset they had ever lost. I didn't bother knocking. I had grown up in that house. The door had never required ceremony before, and tonight didn't feel like the time to start pretending it did. So I pushed it open and stepped inside. The familiar scent hit me. First polished wood, expensive, cooking the faint trace of wine that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. For a moment, it almost felt like walking into a memory. But memories soften things. Reality doesn't. Voices drifted from the dining room. Light laughter, the clink of silverware. The kind of casual sound people make when they assume everything is under control. When I stepped into the doorway, my mother saw me first. Her reaction was immediate. "Jasmine." She rushed forward with her arms open wide, moving quickly enough that anyone watching might believe she'd been counting the minutes until I arrived. "Oh, look at you," she said, pulling me into a quick embrace. "We've missed you so much, darling." The hug was light, brief, carefully measured. The kind of hug designed to be seen rather than felt. I didn't hug back. I simply stood there letting her arms circle me for a moment before she stepped away again, smiling brightly, like a hostess greeting a guest instead of a mother greeting her daughter. "You look tired," Olivia said from the table. My sister leaned back in her chair, swirling a glass of red wine like she was auditioning for a lifestyle magazine cover. Her eyes moved slowly over my outfit. "Is that hotel job running you ragged?" There it was. Olivia had always been talented at that particular art form. The compliment that wasn't a compliment. The casual jab wrapped in a smile. She needed me to be struggling. Because if I wasn't, then her own influencer career, the one that had been quietly fading for the last 2 years, looked even smaller by comparison. Something like that, I said. Just enough words to answer the question. Not enough to correct her. I didn't mention the awards the resorts had won last quarter. I didn't mention the magazine cover a travel publication had asked me to shoot next month. I let the misunderstanding live a little longer. The table was already set when I sat down. Not the everyday dishes. The good china, crystal glasses, heavy silverware, linen napkins folded with the kind of precision usually reserved for investors, politicians, or people whose opinions my father valued. Interesting. My father sat at the head of the table exactly where he always had. Back straight, expression calm, playing the role of benevolent patriarch with the ease of someone who had rehearsed it his entire life. He raised his glass as I settled into the chair. "To family," he said. The others lifted their glasses too, to being together again. Crystal tapped against crystal. The sound echoed briefly across the room before fading. I took a small sip of water. My mother immediately launched into conversation. Something about an upcoming charity gala guest lists the kind of donors who might attend. Her voice filled the space easily, carefully, avoiding a single question about my life. "We really did miss you," she added at one point, almost as an afterthought. I glanced at the chair beside me. It was empty. But in my mind, it wasn't, because suddenly I could see her, the younger version of me, 22 years old, sitting in a crowded graduation auditorium with a cap sliding slightly sideways on her head, holding a phone in both hands, checking it every 30 seconds, waiting, just waiting for a message that said, "We're here." I remembered that day too clearly. The smell of the auditorium, the restless movement of hundreds of families shifting in their seats, parents standing with cameras, cheering whenever a familiar name echoed across the speakers. I remembered walking across the stage when my turn came. The applause was polite, generic, because the cheers in that room belonged to someone else's family. Mine had been busy that day, busy celebrating something far more important. Joshua buying a new truck. The memory still had a way of tightening something deep in my chest. The ghost of that girl looked over at me, now sitting quietly in the empty chair beside mine. Her eyes were red around the edges, hopeful in the fragile way people are when they're trying not to cry in public. She wanted something from them. Recognition, love, proof that she mattered. For a second, the urge to protect her hit me so hard it almost took my breath away. Because I knew something she didn't. She was never going to get it. And tonight wasn't about asking again. Tonight was about making sure she never had to. I set my glass down gently on the table. The small click of crystal against wood cut through my mother's story. "Dad," I said calmly. Every head turned. "You said this dinner was important." I folded my hands on the table, my voice steady, controlled. "So let's skip the small talk." I met his eyes across the table. "Why am I really here?" The moment the words left my mouth, the temperature at the table shifted. Just like that, my mother's cheerful story collapsed mid-sentence. Olivia's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Even Joshua stopped scrolling on his phone. Across the table, my father leaned back slowly in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He studied me for a moment the way men like him always do when they're deciding how much truth they're willing to share. Then he gave a small nod as if approving my directness. "Well," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "since you insist on getting straight to it. Of course." To him, this wasn't uncomfortable. It was just business. "We have a situation," he continued. He said it the same way someone might mention a delayed shipment or a minor scheduling issue. A temporary liquidity problem. Liquidity. Interesting choice of words. "The drought this year has been difficult," he went on. "Production is down across the valley, yields are lower than projected, and the bank has been unusually rigid about extending our credit line." Unusually rigid. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. Uncle Robert leaned forward, then folding his hands together on the table. His voice always had that slick quality to it, like oil poured over concrete. "But there's a solution," he said quickly. "There always is." He glanced toward my father before continuing. "The Silver Creek estate next door is being auctioned, specifically their water rights." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Silver Creek, of course. Robert kept talking. "If we secure those rights, we control irrigation for the entire lower valley. That means stability, expansion, protection against future drought cycles." My father nodded approvingly. "It would secure the vineyard's future for another generation." Generations. That word always came up when they wanted something. And I asked. Just one word. Robert smiled slightly. "And to secure the bid," he said, "we need capital." There it was. The moment they had invited me for. My father set his glass down and looked at me directly. "We'll need $1 million, he said. He didn't say it carefully. He didn't even lower his voice. The number landed on the table with the same casual weight as someone asking for another bottle of wine. 1 million, I repeated. Liquid. Robert added quickly. Immediately available. Silence hovered over the table. I looked from one face to another. Not a single one of them looked embarrassed, not even slightly uncomfortable. To them, this wasn't a request. It was logistics. "We'll need the transfer initiated by tomorrow morning," my father continued. "The auction technically closed 2 days ago, but the buyer hasn't been publicly announced yet. There's still room to negotiate. Negotiate, or bully. The two had always been interchangeable in his vocabulary. "We'll simply make a stronger offer and push them out of the deal," Robert said with a shrug. "That's how business works." Olivia stabbed at her salad with a fork, clearly bored by the details. "It's not like we're asking for something unreasonable," she said. Her eyes flicked toward me. "We know you've been doing fine with your little hotels." Little hotels? I almost smiled. Joshua leaned back in his chair, arms crossed behind his head. "Yeah," he said. "You've done pretty well for yourself." My father raised a hand, slightly reclaiming the conversation. "What your sister means," he said smoothly, "is that you're in a position to contribute." Contribute? To what I asked quietly? He looked genuinely surprised by the question. "To the family," he said. The way he said it made the answer sound obvious. "This vineyard has been in our name for 3 generations. Your grandfather built it from nothing. Everything we have comes from this land." His voice carried that familiar tone, the one that always appeared when he started talking about legacy. "It's your responsibility to help preserve that." Responsibility. I let the words sit there for a moment. Olivia rolled her eyes slightly. "Don't act shocked," she said. "It's not like you built your success in a vacuum." Her gaze sharpened. You have Dad's business instincts. You grew up around this environment. You had the advantage of our name." Joshua nodded. "Exactly." Then Robert leaned forward again, his smile widening. "You come from good stock, Jasmine," he said. The phrase made my skin crawl. Strong genes, good instincts. You inherited those things from this family. He tapped the table lightly. "So, it's only fair that some of the dividends come back to the source." Dividends. There it was again. The investment language. My father spread his hands calmly. "Think of it as paying your dues." I looked around the table slowly. They weren't asking for help. They weren't even pretending this was optional. In their minds, the equation was simple. I had succeeded. Therefore, that success belonged at least partially to them. My sleepless nights, my risks, the years I spent building something from scratch, all of it in their minds was just an extension of the family brand, a satellite office of their legacy. They mocked my work as a cute little hobby in one breath, and demanded that same hobby save their entire operation in the next. I let the silence stretch. In the center of the table, sitting quietly between the serving dishes, was the bottle of wine I had brought when I arrived. A dark vintage. Dusty label. No one had touched it. No one had even bothered to read it. They had been too busy looking at my wallet to look at the gift. Finally, my father clasped his hands together again. So he said. His tone carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already over. "We'll need that transfer started first thing in the morning." I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I reached for my napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth, even though I hadn't eaten a single bite of the meal in front of me. The small gesture bought me a few seconds, and in those seconds, the room stayed perfectly still. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I was calculating whether I could afford their request. But that had never been the question. I set the napkin down carefully beside my plate. The soft sound of linen touching wood seemed louder than it should have. Then I bent down and picked up the leather portfolio resting beside my chair. The zipper slid open with a quiet hiss. It reminded me of a blade being drawn. "You're right about one thing," I said calmly. "Business is business." My father nodded slightly, as if we were finally speaking the same language. And in business, I continued pulling out the first stack of papers. Before you invest a single dollar, you conduct due diligence. I slid the documents across the table toward Uncle Robert. The stack stopped neatly in front of him. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he looked down. I watched his expression change. At first, it was mild curiosity, the polite glance someone gives paperwork they assume will confirm what they already believe. Then the color began draining from his face. "What is this?" he muttered. "A forensic audit," I said simply. Robert's eyes darted across the pages. Line after line of financial records, transaction histories, loan agreements, offshore transfers. "You mentioned the bank being unreasonable." I continued smoothing the edge of the document with my fingertips. "But according to these filings, the bank has actually been remarkably patient." My father frowned slightly, leaning forward. Robert shifted in his chair. "You've leveraged the estate 3 separate times in the last 5 years," I went on. "Each time to cover increasingly risky investments." His mouth opened. "Cryptocurrency speculation," I said, tapping one page lightly, followed by offshore gaming losses. "That's private information." Robert snapped, suddenly his hand slapping down over the papers as if he could hide them. His voice had lost its oily smoothness. It sounded thin now. "Where did you get this?" "Public records," I replied calmly, "and a very competent investigator." The table had gone silent. My father's eyes moved from Robert to the documents. then back again. I kept talking before either of them could interrupt. "You don't actually need $1 million to secure water rights," I said. Robert's jaw tightened. "You need $1 million to cover the balloon payment on the second mortgage you took out against the vineyard." My father's head snapped toward him. "Second mortgage," he said sharply. Robert looked trapped now, his fingers gripping the edge of the papers. I was handling things he muttered defensively, but I wasn't finished. I reached back into the portfolio and pulled out a second stack. This one looked very different. Glossy paper, heavy cardstock covers, professional printing. I placed the brochures gently in the center of the table, directly over the untouched appetizers. "And regarding my little hotel job," I said, turning my attention toward Olivia, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Olivia frowned. I opened the brochure slowly and rotated it so everyone could see. The photograph filled both pages, a sweeping aerial shot of a resort carved into a jungle-covered cliffside. Infinity pools spilling toward the ocean. Villas woven into the canopy like something out of an architectural dream. At the bottom of the page, a gold-embossed logo gleamed in the light. "The Jasmine Collective." Olivia leaned forward slightly. Joshua's phone slipped out of his hand onto the table with a soft clatter. "I don't work for a hotel chain," I said evenly. "I own the chain." No one spoke. I flipped another page. Images of different properties followed. A desert retreat built into sandstone cliffs. A floating eco-lodge surrounded by mangrove forests. A mountain resort overlooking a glacier-fed lake. 12 luxury eco-resorts, I continued, across 4 continents. My mother stared at the photos like she was trying to understand a language she'd never seen before. "We specialize in sustainable luxury," I said. "High net worth privacy, fully integrated environmental design." Then I reached into the portfolio one last time and pulled out a thin document. The valuation report. I slid it across the table toward my father. He hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the page slowly, then faster, and finally they stopped, right at the number printed near the bottom. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. His eyebrows rose slightly, his lips parted. For a second, he looked like someone who had just stepped into deeper water than he expected. "Last quarter," I said quietly, "the Jasmine Collective was valued at $56.5 million. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Joshua was staring at me like I had suddenly grown another head. Olivia's mouth had fallen open slightly, her earlier confidence dissolving into something closer to disbelief. My mother kept looking back and forth between the brochure and my face, like she was trying to reconcile 2 completely different versions of the same person. My father lowered the paper slowly. "You're saying," he began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. I closed the portfolio and rested my hands calmly on top of it. "I didn't build that using your name," I said. "In fact, I structured the entire company under a shell brand, specifically, so no one would associate it with this family." My voice stayed steady, controlled. "Your reputation," I added gently, "would have been bad for business." No one spoke. They were still staring at the numbers, still trying to recalculate everything they thought they knew about me. The quiet daughter with the little hotel job, the one they thought they could pressure into writing a check. The room had changed, and for the first time since I walked in, they were the ones trying to catch up. For a long moment, no one spoke. The valuation report still rested in my father's hands, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. Around the table, the expressions were all the same: shock, disbelief, The quiet panic that comes when a situation stops making sense. They had invited me here expecting a checkbook. Instead, they were staring at a number they hadn't even imagined. I let the silence stretch a little longer. Then I said the words they were waiting for. "So no," I said, calmly closing the portfolio in front of me. "I won't be investing in the vineyard." My father blinked. The sentence didn't fit inside the version of reality he was trying to rebuild in his head. "Wait," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Jasmine." The authority that usually filled his tone had softened into something closer to uncertainty. "If you have that kind of capital," he continued, slowly tapping the valuation report, "then $1 million is nothing to you." He leaned forward across the table. "Pocket change, really?" Olivia nodded quickly as if she had just rediscovered the argument. "Exactly," she said. "This isn't even a real sacrifice for you." My mother folded her hands together anxiously. "We're talking about saving the family land," she added. "The vines will die without water." I listened. Every word confirmed the same thing. They still believed this was a negotiation, that somewhere in this room, there was a number that would make me cooperate. "That's exactly why I didn't come here to invest," I said quietly. Then I reached toward the center of the table. The bottle of wine I had brought when I arrived was still sitting there exactly where I'd placed it earlier. Dark glass, a thin layer of dust along the shoulders, elegant cream-colored label. Not a single person had touched it. Not one of them had even glanced at the writing. They had been too focused on my bank account. I picked up the bottle and held it gently by the neck. "Dad," I said. He looked up confused. "Read the label?" He frowned slightly, but reached for the bottle when I handed it to him. The room watched. His eyes moved across the front of the label first. "Silver Creek Estate," he read slowly. A small crease appeared between his eyebrows. He glanced back at me. "This is from next door," he said. "Why would you bring?" "Keep reading," I said. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass. The silence in the room thickened. He lowered his eyes again, scanning the smaller print near the bottom. That's when it happened. His breath caught. Not dramatically, just a small involuntary hitch in his chest. The bottle slipped from his fingers and thudded heavily against the table, rolling slightly before stopping near the center. No one moved. My father stared at the label like it had just rewritten the laws of physics. Then he looked up at me. His face had lost its color. "Proprietor," he whispered. He swallowed hard. "J. Jasmine." My mother leaned forward sharply. What she said. Olivia grabbed the bottle and turned it toward herself. Her eyes widened as she found the same line. Joshua leaned over her shoulder. "What does that even mean?" he asked. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "It means," I said evenly, "that I didn't come here to help you bid on Silver Creek." My father's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "You're not making sense," he said. I met his gaze. "I bought Silver Creek." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. For a second, no one reacted. Then everything hit at once. "You what?" Angela gasped. Olivia's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she pushed herself upright. "You bought it," Joshua said, his voice cracking. I nodded once. 2 days ago, I said, $41 million, cash. The number seemed to echo against the walls. Robert's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. But I wasn't finished. "I own the estate," I continued. "The land, the vines." Then I paused. And more importantly, I watched their faces carefully. "I own the senior water rights." That was the moment the real understanding arrived. You could see it moving across the table like a wave. First confusion, then calculation, then pure naked realization. Silver Creek didn't just have vineyards. It controlled the primary water source, feeding the entire lower valley, including theirs. My father leaned back slowly in his chair like someone who had just discovered the ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. "You're saying," he started, but the sentence died halfway out of his mouth. "Yes," I said gently. "The auction you were planning to crash, the one you were going to bully someone out of." I tilted my head slightly. It never happened. Robert's knuckles had turned white against the edge of the table. "You made a preemptive offer," he murmured. I did. A long, hollow silence filled the room, because now they understood something they hadn't considered when they invited me to dinner. I wasn't the struggling daughter they thought they could pressure. I wasn't a convenient investor waiting to rescue their failing vineyard. And I certainly wasn't a guest asking permission to sit at their table. I was their neighbor, their competition, and the only person in the valley who now controlled the water their vines needed to survive. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended in midair. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the rules of gravity had quietly changed, and everyone was waiting to see what would fall first. Then my father exhaled slowly. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The confident patriarch who had been casually demanding $1 million an hour ago was gone. In his place sat a man trying very hard not to panic. So he said carefully, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "You control the water." I nodded once. "Yes." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, buying himself time. "Well then," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "that actually simplifies things." Olivia looked at him quickly, hope flickering across her face. My father clasped his hands together on the table. "We can work something out," he said. "A private agreement, an easement perhaps. You divert part of the flow to our irrigation channels, just enough to keep the vines alive." His tone had shifted into negotiation mode. Measured, practical, controlled. "We'd compensate you, of course," he added quickly. "Over time." Uncle Robert nodded eagerly beside him. "Yes, exactly. Structured payments, a family rate." "Family rate?" The phrase hung in the air like a desperate bargain. Angela leaned forward suddenly, her composure finally cracking. "Please, Jasmine," she said softly. Her eyes were glossy now. "I know things haven't always been perfect between us, but this is still your home." She gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the dark fields beyond. "If the water doesn't reach those vines, they'll die." Joshua swallowed hard. "In a month," he said quietly. No one contradicted him, because everyone at the table knew he was being optimistic. I listened to them carefully. The pleading, the bargaining, the sudden rediscovery of words like family and home. Then I reached down and zipped my portfolio closed. The sound was soft final. "I'm afraid that won't work," I said. Robert blinked. "What?" "My business model," I continued calmly, "is built around sustainability." My father frowned slightly. "That's not what we're talking about." "Yes," I said gently. "It is." I folded my hands on the table. "My plan for Silver Creek isn't traditional agriculture." Olivia stared at me. "Then what is it?" "Restoration." The word landed quietly, but its meaning took a second to sink in. "I'm removing the artificial irrigation dams," I explained. "Reopening the natural stream channels, letting the water return to the ecosystem it originally fed." Joshua shook his head slowly. "That doesn't make any sense," he said. "Why would you do that?" "Because the land was never meant to support this level of commercial farming," I replied. The calm in my voice seemed to make Robert more agitated. "You're talking about destroying a perfectly productive valley," he snapped. I looked at him. "No," I said evenly. "I'm talking about restoring it." Angela's hands were trembling now. "But if you don't redirect the water," she whispered. I finished the sentence for her. "Your vines will dry out." Silence pressed down on the room. Joshua looked like he might be sick. Robert slammed a palm against the table. "You're bankrupting your own family." I stood slowly, pushing my chair back from the table. No, I corrected him. I picked up my portfolio. I'm just declining to subsidize a failing business. Then I looked directly at my father. You taught me that rule yourself. His eyes held mine wide and disbelieving. Never throw good money after bad. The shouting started before I even reached the doorway. At first, it was just raised voices behind me. Sharp, frantic, overlapping. My father barking questions at Robert. Robert firing back defensive explanations. Olivia's voice rising above both of them in a thin, angry pitch. The kind of chaos that happens when people realize the story they've been telling themselves is collapsing. I didn't turn around. The dining room had always been the center of that house. The place where decisions were made, alliances formed, blame assigned. Growing up, I had spent countless evenings sitting quietly at that table, listening to conversations that never seemed to include me. Tonight, for the first time, I was leaving while they were still talking. My mother called my name somewhere behind me. Jasmine, wait. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, but I kept walking. The foyer was dim and quiet compared to the storm erupting in the next room. Portraits of long dead relatives lined the walls, their oil-painted eyes watching from gilded frames. Generations of proud vineyard owners. Men who believed land was forever. I wondered briefly what they would think if they could see the argument unfolding in the dining room right now. Probably the same thing I did. Poor management. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit my face clean and steady. Somewhere out in the dark fields, the wind moved softly through the rows of vines. For a second, I just stood there. Not because I was hesitating, just because it was quiet. Then I walked down the steps and across the circular drive to the gray rental sedan, waiting where I had left it. Behind me, the shouting inside the house had grown louder. Now I could hear distinct pieces of it. You never told me about the second mortgage. You were supposed to manage the accounts. This is your fault. No, it's yours. It sounded less like a family argument and more like a company boardroom right after a bankruptcy announcement. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather felt cool under my hands as I started the engine. As I pulled away from the house, my phone lit up on the passenger seat. Dad calling. A second later, Mom calling. Then a message. Olivia. Another message. Robert. The screen kept lighting up again and again as the car rolled slowly down the long driveway. I didn't block the numbers. I didn't answer them either. Instead, I flipped the phone face down on the seat. The tires crunched over the thinning gravel as I passed through the open gate and turned onto the narrow road leading out of the estate. For years I had imagined this moment, the confrontation, the reveal, the moment they would finally understand exactly who I had become. In every version of the fantasy, I felt something powerful afterward. Triumph, vindication, maybe even anger. But as the vineyard disappeared in the rearview mirror, I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel satisfied. I felt nothing. At first, that emptiness surprised me. But the longer I sat with it, the more I understood what it really was. Freedom. Hate takes energy. So does resentment. You have to keep feeding those emotions to keep them alive. You replay old memories, old conversations, old disappointments. You carry those people around in your head long after they've stopped thinking about you. But somewhere along the way, I had run out of that energy. Not because I forgave them, and not because they suddenly deserved kindness. I had simply moved beyond them. The same way a company outgrows its original investors. They weren't giants I needed to defeat anymore. They weren't monsters under my bed. They were just people. Small, ordinary people who happened to share my last name. people who used to know me. I rolled the window down as the road curved toward the highway. Cool night air rushed into the car, carrying the faint scent of soil and distant water. Ahead of me, the valley stretched wide and dark beneath the stars. Somewhere out there, past the next set of hills, was the land I had just bought. Silver Creek, the estate they had been so desperate to control. The water, the future. I pressed lightly on the accelerator and the car picked up speed. The silence inside the vehicle no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't driving toward approval. I was driving toward the life I had already built with my own hands. Sometimes the hardest part of growing isn't at the work. It's realizing some people were never meant to grow with you. I used to think closure meant winning, proving something, getting the last word. But peace doesn't sound like victory, it sounds like silence. The kind you earn when you stop chasing approval and start building your own life instead. If this story felt familiar, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe, because next time we're talking about what happens when the people who ignored you suddenly try to come back.